Good afternoon, and thank you for joining me today to talk about founding families in the National Archives. My name's Alison, and I'm a Senior Archival Officer in our Victoria office. Our team's responsible for public-facing services, including reference and access. I'm going to give a brief presentation about family history resources at the National Archives, with a focus on what we have in our Melbourne collection. Before I start, the National Archives Australia acknowledges the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout Australia and acknowledges their continuing connection to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to the people, their cultures, and elders, past, present, and emerging. Today, we're going to have a quick overview of the National Archives, talk about particular records of interest to family historians, have a bit of a chat about researching at the National Archives, and I'm going to give you an example from my own family. Just a couple of things to let you know before I start. Your microphone and your camera will automatically be off. If you have any questions throughout, just pop them in the chat and we'll answer them at the end. This session is also being recorded and it will be sent out in a few days. What is the National Archives? It's the archives of the Commonwealth, i.e. federal government. We were established in 1961 and operate under the Archives Act 1983. This act regulates the management of Commonwealth records. We work with federal government agencies to identify the most significant records to be retained as national archives. We manage and preserve around 350 kilometres of records in various formats, not just paper files, but also photographs, maps, film, objects, and now born digital data and information. We have offices and repositories all across Australia. The Archives Act also establishes rights of access to Commonwealth records, which are more than 20 years old, subject to specific exceptions where release could still damage national security, foreign affairs, or have impacts on people's personal or business affairs. The Victoria State Office is split across two sites. Our public-facing services are delivered from the Victorian Archive Centre in North Melbourne. Here, we're co-located with the Public Records Office Victoria, PROV. The primary purpose of our reading room is to view original records. Our part of the reading room is only open Wednesday to Friday, so you need to pre-order original records to view in person, and we ask for 5 business days' notice to do that. However, our team at North Melbourne provide a full 5-day-a-week reference service via phone and online. Our collections operations team is located at the East Burwood Repository, and they focus on collection management, digitisation, and preservation. There are more than 40 million items in the NAA collection. Most of the collection is post-Federation, but some significant series of older records were inherited from the state or colonial governments at or after Federation. The collection helps to preserve the memory of the nation. It helps all Australians to understand the key decisions and actions of government, the nation's identity, the big events in Australian history, how the country has evolved over time, and interaction between government and individuals. However, NAA is not just a historical archive. The preservation of the most significant records forms part of the framework of accountability within which government operates. You might be familiar with the news stories on the 1st of January every year when the Cabinet papers from 20 years ago were released. This is an important way in which governments ultimately remain accountable for the decisions they make. Also, our collection is important to protecting the rights and entitlements of Australians. For example, we're often asked to provide someone with proof of their arrival in Australia for pension purposes. On top of all of that, we're a key resource for family historians. So what can you look for? In terms of family history, the starting point is to consider what interaction might the person you are looking for have had with the Commonwealth government. There are many ways your family might have had contact with the government. Some of the more common ways include, like myself, migrating to Australia and becoming an Australian citizen, serving in the Army, Air Force or Navy, or working for the government. From there, you need to have a think about what types of records we might hold about them. Sometimes that will be straightforward and easy. In other cases, it can involve a lot of digging and following a paper trail. The first type of records we'll have a look at today are immigration, which are of significant interest to family historians. These types of records include migrant selection documents, passenger arrival records, alien registration records, and naturalization records. So we'll have a look at each types of these records now. A good portion of our inquiries are from people looking for records of their voyage to Australia. Most of our passenger record holdings start from the early 1920s. However, we do have a scattering of records prior to that. Here we have a passenger arrival card for arrival by air. People will either appear on a list or have a card depending on what year they arrived and by what means. As you can see, passenger arrival cards include some basic biographical details, such as the nationality, date of birth, and intended address of the passenger. In this case, you might recognize a familiar name of one of the country's favorite fictional netballers. Our passenger records are arranged chronologically by port. We have ships lists for some ports beginning in the 1850s and aircraft records from 1940s. These appear in an online passenger arrivals index, which goes from 1898 to 1972. This is an example of a passenger list from our collection for the SS Cathay, which arrived in Fremantle on the 4th of November 1930. As you can see, passenger lists only record basic information such as name, age, place of departure and nationality, and sometimes occupation or intended address in Australia. While they may not contain a great deal of information, many families find them to be a nice memento of their move to Australia, and the details on the lists or cards can sometimes act as a breadcrumb in the trail to finding other types of records. Many of the passenger lists are now digitized, but it's not always easy to identify your person. Our passenger arrivals index on record search is a good starting point, but not necessarily conclusive. For post 1972 arrivals, the best approach is to put in a reference inquiry, something we'll talk about doing a bit later. This is a screenshot of our passenger arrivals index available through record search. Digitized passenger lists have been indexed and are now searchable through our NAA database record search. A range of parameters can be used to search for results, which will be linked to the associated digitized passenger list. This index draws on passenger arrivals in Fremantle, usually the first port of call for voyages from Europe before travelling east to other states. In Victoria, the key passenger arrivals list is series B4397, which has been digitised and is accessible in quarterly sections through record search, then arranged in date order by voyage. So it can take some time and some clicking to locate your person. Migrant selection documents are another key type of immigration record held at NAA. The Commonwealth Government played a big role in migration post-World War II, with many schemes for assisted migration. Think £10 POMs, the Dutch scheme, Displaced Persons scheme, and a Maltese assisted passage scheme. Those who came to Australia on assisted passage will have an application and migrant selection documents. These documents were compiled overseas when people applied to migrate to Australia under one of those post-war migration schemes. These records are one of the best sources of family history information on a migrant. They vary in the amount of detail they provide, but generally contain a range of personal details such as name, address, place and date of birth, gender, marital status, and nationality. Other details may include a physical description, the occupation of the person, their education, proposed employment, and names of other family members, as well as health checks, and some really lovely black and white photographs. The photo on this slide is from the Destination Australia photograph series, promoting travel from the UK to Australia. Some other immigration records we hold are migrant camp or hostel records. These were Commonwealth-run hostels such as Glenelg, Finsbury, Pennington, and Rosewater, and of course Onegilla in Victoria. We have alien registration documents. The key series for this is B78 in Victoria. Until the 1970s, non-British migrants were required to register as aliens upon arrival, and we have extensive series of these in Victoria. Before that, non-European migrants had to obtain a certificate of exemption from the dictation test if they were leaving Australia but wanted to return. So that's our certificates of exemption series. We also have naturalisation files and certificates in Victoria going back to the late 1840s, and there's multiple series. One of the key ones in Victoria is series B44. Here we have two examples of applications for registration as an alien or alien registration documents. The threat posed by World War II during the 20th century twice caused the Australian government to require all aliens, i.e. non-British subjects or foreign nationals living in Australia, to register with local authorities. Registration was required between 1916 and 1926, and again between 1939 and 1971. Conditions of alien registration changed throughout the century, but obviously increased around the World War II period when aliens had to report every house move, change of job, marriage, or change of name, and some were even interned in camps. On these examples here, you can see the age means they vary slightly. One has fingerprints, but again, they largely have basic biographical details, including dates and means of arrival as well. As I mentioned before, the certificates of exemption from dictation test were when foreign nationals were leaving Australia but wanted to return. This is an example for George R. Gunn, issued in 1917 from Victoria Series B13. The language used in this record serves as a reminder that while undertaking family history research, we will encounter language and terms that belong to a certain time and may be uncomfortable to read. Here, that would be under the description of nationality. Another popular collection of records relevant to family history is naturalization records. Naturalization really just means becoming a citizen. We hold naturalisation records for the colonies of South Australia and Victoria from the 1850s and for all Australian states from 1904. Records of other colonies prior to Federation are held by the various state archives. We hold naturalisation files, which basically contain all the paperwork surrounding a person's application to be naturalised. These files can contain a lot of useful information, such as personal details, places of residence, dates of arrival in Australia, details of family members, occupations. Sometimes there'll be reference letters in there and police checks. We also hold duplicates of actual naturalisation certificates up to 1961, when the Department of Immigration stopped making duplicate copies. The photo on the left here is from the Immigration Photographic Archive, and it's a citizenship ceremony at the Malvern Town Hall in 1953. I have to say, it looks a bit more fancy and formal than the one I went to in Brighton in 2009. We've already talked about passenger arrivals, but we also have records relating to ships and crew going back to the 1850s. We have crew lists starting from 1907. We also have records of deserters, discharges, engagements, and other 19th century crew records, many of which have now been digitized and are available online. And we also have some lighthouse records. This is an example of a crew list from the MV Coron in 1957. It includes the crew members' nationality, age, role in the ship, and their date of engagement. And this one is an example of a record card of an Australian merchant seaman from series A8877. This series consists of microfilm copies of records of the employment of Australian merchant seamen. The film contains copies of record cards for each individual seafarer on which were recorded details of service on all of their ships. The second key category of records that we're going to have a look at today is Defence Service records. They're a rich source of family history. The National Archives holds the service records of the 420,000 people who served in World War I, as well as the records of the 1.3 million Australians who served in World War II. You can also access the records of permanent servicemen or people who served in later conflicts through the National Archives by contacting reference services. Post-World War II service records are often not listed on the database. They're currently in the custody of the Defence Archives Centre here in Melbourne, but we can request them to make them accessible for clients. Sorry, I should clarify, that's for post-World War II Army records. Service records are usually in the form of personnel files known as dossiers. These records typically include enlistment papers, records of service and movements of the servicemen, discharge papers, some correspondence, a photograph of the service person, and information on any injuries sustained in service. All of our World War I and World War II service records have now been digitized and can be viewed online. This is the result of a major project, Defend the Past, Protect the Future, which has recently completed the digitization of these service records. Some of our other popular defence records are the Boer War dossiers for Victorian contingents. The NAA has enrolment forms and nominal rolls. The series of B5177 and B5179. For World War I service, the main series is B2455 for the first AIF, and that's been digitised. We also have records for interwar militia, the second AIF, and the CMF, and post-World War II, for example, Korea, Malaya, and Vietnam in series B2458. We also hold some national service records, court-martial files, and prisoner of war records. In addition to those, we have series for Royal Australian Navy, for Navy officer cards and petty officer cards, and for the Royal Australian Air Force. Some other types of Defence Service records we hold are routine orders, including attachments, detachments, and casualties by unit, court-martials, and prisoner of war, as I mentioned before, and prisoner of war trust fund records, series by B503, which is located here in Melbourne. We also have repatriation or DVA case files. For World War I, this is series B73, and for World War II is series B26. These series consist of the files of ex-servicemen who fought in World War I and World War II respectively, or of their dependents. These records are located in Victoria, and each file deals with one individual and may consist of one or more of the following. They contain information about particulars of service, disability and medical history, treatment, dependents, correspondence regarding claims and entitlements, and tribunal records and pensions. They can be quite large records with extensive details, particularly around medical history and determinations of pensions and benefits based on war service. Another record we have, which has been digitized, is the medals and badges registers for World War I and World War II. We have some additional records relating to civilian service during World War II, to do with the Civilian Construction Corps, the Civil Alien Corps, and the Australian Women's Land Army. The third and final type of records we're going to talk about today are investigation case files. The archives hold various records of security agencies. These agencies often created files on persons of interest, especially German and Japanese nationals and people who were connected with radical political groups, such as socialist and communist movements and parties. Prior to 1949, the Commonwealth Investigation Service was the main agency involved. However, from 1949 onwards, this role was taken over by ASIO. ASIO records are still held by ASIO until a request is made through the archives. These requests must come through us and can only be made for records dating within the open period. In order to apply for access to an ASIO record, you need to supply us not only with the full name and date of birth of the person you're interested in, but also where they were living and the reason you believe they may have been under surveillance. ASIO doesn't keep files on everyone. only those they considered to be of security interest, which quite often changed according to the political and social environment at the time. In terms of investigation case files, we also have the World War I and World War II interment records. An example of which we have here. This is an interment record for a German-born scientist. In 1935, he emigrated to Australia, and from 1940 to 1944, he was interned as an enemy alien. He later died in Sydney in 1967. On this card, you can actually see that it's a notification of a change of address to number 1 internment camp in Tatura here in Victoria. Here we'll move on to some of the more intriguing records in our collection, our ASIO files. This is an extract from the ASIO file of Doris McRae. In the 1940s, Doris was one of the most senior female educators in Victoria. Beyond the classroom, Doris was also a pacifist, women's rights campaigner, communist, and a person of interest to ASIO. Here you can see a memorandum from the information in the ASIO file about Doris, detailing her political affiliations, including a presentation about a visit to the USSR. Doris had strong links with the Communist Party of Australia. In 1946, Doris was wrongly accused in the Victorian Parliament of spreading communist propaganda in the classroom. She was later accused of forming a communist cell within the Victorian Teachers' Union. Doris retired from teaching on health grounds due to the emotional strain caused by the campaign against her. Here we have a record that for someone that some of you might recognize, Peter Kundle. Peter first came to ASIO's attention in 1959 through his contact with the Pioneer Bookshop in Sydney. The same year, his name also appeared on mailing lists for the Tribune newspaper. In 1960, ASIO received a report that Peter had joined the Communist Party's branch in Launceston, Victoria. He also became secretary of the Launceston Peace Forum. Peter was soon very active in the party locally, hosting meetings at his house and becoming a branch delegate to the state conference. In 1961, he stood for election to the Senate as a Communist Party candidate and also was acting state secretary for the Communist Party in Tasmania. Here we have a surveillance photograph of Peter attending the Communist Party State Conference in 1964. Peter started growing disillusioned with the internal divisions within the party. He admitted this and said he was more interested in the peace movement in Vietnam. He also described himself as a true Australian communist and so considered himself removed from the divisions in the party, including that between the Soviet Union and China. As Peter's career as a landscape gardener was taking off, he had to leave it behind to prioritize his career and his family. And by 1970, when he branched out into broadcasting on Gardening Australia, he was no longer a party member. It's quite amazing that all of this information can be gleaned from an ASIO record compiled about Peter. Another sort of record that we hold at the archives are records of patents and copyrights registered in Australia. These are records of inventions, music, literary works, artworks, advertisements, and more. They were sometimes lodged by companies, but also by individuals. These records won't be of interest to everyone, but if there was an inventor, artist, or a musician in your family, it's possible we'll have records relating to their creations. If you're interested in copyright or patent records, I would suggest that you put in a reference inquiry, as these records can often be confusing and difficult to locate, so we can give you a hand in tracking things down. Our collection also includes bankruptcy records, correspondence files, and personal records deposits from people like governors general, prime ministers, ministers, high court judges, and senior public servants who sent their records to the National Archives as personal record deposits. So how do you find anything? So the best starting point is our website, naa.gov.au. From there, you can register as a researcher and start searching the collection. This is through record search, our catalogue, and the main interaction with the collection that most people will have. I just wanted to highlight a couple of key points, which I'll show you through an example. When you're searching the catalogue, a couple of tips are to keep the search quite broad. Don't put in too much information about dates, etc., so that you get as many results as you can. We also have a function called name search, which is especially useful for family history, but it will be excluding results as it only includes items that are described at item level. So sometimes things will not appear in name search that are in the catalogue. On the website, we also have a family history page with lots of information. We have fact sheets and guides about different types of research, and there's always the option to ask us a question. We can't do people's research for them, but we do respond to inquiries, helping people, telling them which records could be relevant and how they can access them. Here is an example of record search. I've just done a basic search here. I've just entered the keywords, which is the name of the person I'm looking for. And this is an example for my own family. It's my husband's grandfather, Shalom. So when I've conducted this basic search, all I've done is put in his name. And luckily for me, it's quite an unusual name, so it doesn't yield too many results. But when we have a look at the results page, we can see we've got a number here for his name. And this page, is already giving us quite a lot of information about the records. It will tell us the access status, so whether the record has been access examined and there are some exceptions, which will be indicated under open with exception, or if the record is yet to be access examined, so whether it can be made open to the public, it will have not yet examined recorded there. It will also give us the series, which will give us an indication of what the record's about and which agency created it. And we've got the location, so which one of our repositories holds the record. So you can see this top one's in Melbourne, and then the next ones are all up in Canberra. It will also give us the date range of the record, so roughly what dates are included in that record. And it will show us whether the record has been digitized. If it has, clicking on that notebook will take you to the digital copy, and you can view it online through record search. It will also generate the item ID, which is really important information if you are putting in a reference inquiry, so we can have a look for the record that you're referring to. So let's have a look at what is in some of these records. Now, my husband's grandfather passed away before I arrived on the scene, so I never got to meet him, but going through this process has been really fascinating for me, and I think even some of his immediate family have maybe learned a couple of things. So the first record that I identified was Shalom's passenger arrival record. So we can see here that he has arrived via London, and Mr. Shalom, he is the one second from the bottom. He was 15 years old, and he was a student on arrival, and he's from Poland originally. And we can see here that he's travelled with what looks like his parents up top, ages 47 and 44, and his 3 siblings. Here we have some photographs of Shalom that I've sourced from a couple of different records. The photograph on the left is from Shalom's short period of service in the Australian Army. This is from series B883, and Shalom served from 1943 to 1944 at the age of 19. Yes, this is B883, the second Australian Imperial Force Personnel Dossier series. The next 2 records are applications for registration as an alien. The first on the left here is from 1941, and the second from 1948. We can see from the first record here that Shalom at the time was a student, and he was living on Drummond Street in Carlton. In 1948, he's still recorded as a student. This is shortly before his departure to Europe. One of the interesting things about these 2 records side by side is that Shalom's height seems to have changed from 5'2" at 18 to 5'5" 7 years later. Either a very late growth spurt or evidence that government records are fallible, and sometimes we can see inconsistencies in what's recorded there. Continuing on in Shalom's journey, we can see another passenger arrival record here. So this is from March 1951, and Shalom's arrived on a ship, the Orcades. On the left, we can see Shalom is recorded here, and interestingly, he's recorded as stateless, and his profession has changed from student to economist. On another page of the record, we can see two more entries for Borenstein. This shows us that Shalom has now returned with his wife, Janine, age 27, and with a very young daughter. As I said, it's really interesting that before Shalom left in 1948, he was a student, and now, after 3 years overseas, he's become an economist. You can also see from this voyage that Shalom boarded the vessel in Tilbury, and his wife and daughter later joined him from Naples. As you can see, these records can provide interesting and surprising information, even though they seem very limited in their details. Also from Shalom's naturalization record, we have on the left his arrival information for his return from Europe, including a photo in which he's looking significantly older than when he left. You can see from the stamp on this record that Shalom was naturalized in 1965, and his height has stabilized at 5'5". Interestingly, though, the letter on the right indicates that the minister is unable to see his way to grant naturalization in Shalom's favor. Now, this letter was written in 1957. So why did it take so long? What happened between 1957 and 1965? This leads us to the final record on our research, a record from series A6119, personal files recorded by ASIO. As you can see from just the front cover, this record is quite heavily redacted. Without giving too much away, this record does hold the key to what held up Shalom's citizenship applications for so many years. At this point, I think it's important to understand, particularly with records of this nature, that it's a government record that represents the political and social climate of the time. All of the records that we've looked at today only represent the interaction a person has had with the government. They do not always show the full picture of who the person was, or answer questions about their lives, their motivations, or fill in the gaps between their interactions with government. I can say that this is volume 1 of 2 of Shalom's ASIO file. It's quite extensive. It goes into a lot of detail about why naturalization was withheld for so many years, his profession, his interaction with various organizations throughout Australia, information about his family. It's a really, really rich source of information, and it does include an interesting letter from a referee from Melbourne University who described him as dogmatic and quite intense, which his family have confirmed was the case. So I'll leave you there on that little bit of a cliffhanger. But if you're curious, now is the time to get researching and start finding your family in the National Archives.